Nixon sat around at this table and talked about what he wanted the library to be. He was very much hands-on, when it came to defining this place, and it's going through a transition now, being modernized and made, more a pure museum.
The Richard Nixon Presidential Library Museum began life in 1990 as a private institution, and in the middle of 2007 became part of the national system of presidential libraries administered by the National Archives. Presidential libraries are essentially temples of democracy where people come, particularly when they have experienced an era and they relive it by looking at the exhibits, by wandering the grounds, which often are in a place that was important to the president and his family. And it helps them understand better what motivated presidents and what came to preoccupy them when they were in the White House.
John Dean, the ex-White House counsel, testified today that President Nixon knew about the Watergate cover-up.
At one point in the conversation, I recall the president telling me to keep a good list of the press people giving us trouble because we'll make life difficult for them after the election.
Because of the circumstances of President Nixon's departure from office, the controversy that swirled around his White House records, the Nixon Library was a bit of an unwanted orphan in the first years after he had resigned. Duke University tried but failed to be able to persuade their faculty to have both the archives and the museum. Other sites were considered and finally didn't work out. All this time, President Nixon was saying, is it possible it might be in Yorba Linda next to the house my father built? So ironically enough, the controversy about other sites that were suggested paved the way for President Nixon to have what he always wanted, which is to have the library come to Yorba Linda, where the house his father built has stood all these years since he was born in it in 1913. Richard Nixon also chose to be buried here for a very practical reason. He said to me when he was, making these decisions, if they bury Mrs. Nixon and me in Yorba Linda, people will keep coming and visiting, won't they? So he's a practical guy. So he's buried a few steps away from the house where he was born. So it's an American story that draws people to come to a place that gave birth to a president. The Nixon Foundation, not surprisingly, is managed by people who really dig Nixon. Most of us knew him personally. We came to admire him. There's a powerful sense of personal loyalty. We are wise enough to understand this view is not universally shared. In the beginning in 1980, after he and Mrs. Nixon had moved back to New York City, I joined his staff and worked for him in New York or New Jersey from 1980 to 1990, and then came and worked at the library.
I started working for President Nixon in 1980. I was his personal assistant and secretary for 10 years until 1990, at which time I became his last chief of staff until his death in April of 1994. Probably my favorite thing is the birthplace, because I think that was the most precious thing to President Nixon. He enjoyed coming out here. He'd come out here with his grandchildren from time to time. They'd climb upstairs and open the windows overlooking the two trees in the front, and he would show his grandchildren where he'd grown up and where he had played as a child.
The most important thing that people discover is that if there hadn't been Vietnam and America's argument with itself about the war in Vietnam, there wouldn't have been a Watergate. That Vietnam and Watergate are intrinsically related and probably need to be studied and understood together. Number two, he was obsessively preoccupied with U.S.-Russian relations and U.S.-Chinese relations, both as a president and as a former president. He devoted the last 19 years of his life mainly to U.S.-Russian and U.S.-Chinese relations and having an impact on successor presidents as they made their decisions about those relationships, whether Democratic or Republican. The third thing that people, I don't think, fully appreciate about President Nixon, that I hope history will ultimately conclude, it is that Nixon was a quintessentially serious person, cared about ideas, concepts, and principles. And as he prepared for the Frost interviews, which you can see the diligence with which he prepared for them when you look at the materials here in the Nixon Library that he scribbled on and that he studied as he prepared for the interviews, which incidentally Mr. Langella came here to study himself as he was preparing for his role on the London stage. You see the care that Nixon always brought to what he said about important events. The irony is that so much of his unguarded talk is in the public domain now because of the secret White House tapes. And so the challenge that history has is how to balance a person's unguarded conversation with the carefully thought through content of all of his comments about, particularly about foreign policy, his writings, his speeches, his books.
I think there's a lot about Richard Nixon that people don't know and people don't understand, and I think this is the place to learn everything there is about Richard Nixon. It's worth a visit by young people, by middle-aged people, and by older people, because there's a lot to see, there's a lot to learn, and it's a beautiful place.
The reason presidential libraries are important is that indeed we can learn from how presidents have made decisions and grappled with the problems they faced, how we might avoid in the future repeating the same mistakes. So Democrats and Republicans come to the Nixon Library just as Democrats and Republicans go to the Clinton Library, because the president is the president of us all.